Login accepted.
My name is Daniel Wong, and I'll be presenting today. Um, eBoard applications are open until today, actually. Um, so yeah, please sign up if you're interested. Um, RVB is tomorrow, so make sure you are prepared for that. I recommend checking what Clemens has for advice. Who am I? My name is Daniel. I'm a second year CIS major, and I am a previous year and current year NCAE team member. This time I hope to win nationals, so I hope that goes well for me. All right, let's get started. Um, oh, script went away. All right, what is RF? RF, in short terms, it's a special wave. In more technical terms, it's an oscillating electromagnetic field. I should note specifically that although other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum is visible, radio in particular is not. Uh, why do I say it's special? It's not a tangible form like other waves are, and it does not require a medium to travel. Yet somehow it can carry vast amounts of data. Radio waves are capable of going through an antenna and broadcast it into space. It's not to say that they aren't capable of going through a medium and require a vacuum, but they can. The unit of measurement is hertz, and the general range is 30 hertz to 300 gigahertz. I should note specifically that this is a very broad range. I'll get into that later. The main wave components are wavelength, frequency, amplitude, spectrum, and bandwidth. Wavelength is just the length of one wave cycle. It's just one pattern before the wave repeats. The frequency is the number of cycles per second, and the amplitude is the energy or the highest point of a wave if you look at it on a chart. The spectrum is the allocated portion on the electromagnetic spectrum. In this case, used specifically for radio. And the bandwidth is the range of frequencies that can be transmitted over. This can also be regarded as the amount of data you can transmit over. All right, let's get deeper into the science. Uh, some of you might ask, oh, wait, what about microwaves? It is a subset of the radio frequency spectrum, which means it overlaps within the range. So if you want to get more specific, microwaves start from around 3 gigahertz and go up to 300, and radio is below 3 gigahertz, but you can kind of classify them in the same boat as radio waves. But it is still capable of direct communication, but just at higher frequencies. Let's move on to wavelength and frequency. Here, here is the formula. Wavelength equals velocity divided by frequency. They are, as you can see, wavelength and frequency are inversely proportional. What does that mean? As one increases, the other one decreases. So, as wavelength gets bigger, uh, the frequency gets smaller, and vice versa. As the wavelength gets smaller, the higher the frequency, the faster the cycles repeat. And you might ask about velocity. Well, velocity here is just the speed of light, meaning that in all cases where you are calculating wavelength for radio frequency, speed is not a factor in how long the wavelength will be or how fast your frequency is. Continuing on, just a visual for you guys. Uh, it as you can see, the lower the wavelength, the faster the frequency, the more cycles you can fit into 1 second, which is synonymous with what we've been discussing so far. Wavelength, in this case, in the first instance, they start at crest, but it would be easier to say that it's just a repeating pattern. So once the second crest or the top of the wavelength comes around, then the pattern stops and begins again, and that is your wavelength. Science part 3. Well, I guess you can't go on with a radio frequency explanation without the electromagnetic spectrum. And just to make it easy for you, 3 times 10 to the ninth is just 3 gigahertz. Uh, you can see that for microwave, 3 times 10 to the 11th is 300 gigahertz, where I said the range was, and it fits right below infrared. And a visual demonstration at the bottom of the spectrum, frequency steadily increases as the wavelength gets shorter. All right, science part 4, bandwidth. Um, it's just a range of frequencies, but in that range, it determines how much data you can transmit at one time. I'm going to go back into Ryan's domain a bit with Wi-Fi and talk about the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi range. As you can see, there are four channels, but 1, 6, and 11 are the only ones used because 14 is only used in Japan. That is a weird thing, but bandwidth just well, there are 3 channels open, and in order for them to be used, they have to be uninterrupted and they have to not overlap each other. And in this case, because there are only 13 usable channels for 2.4 gigahertz, there are 3 channels that are non-overlapping and that allow you to transmit at one time. The channel space for 2.4 gigahertz is, I believe, 5 megahertz, and that allows you to have only 3 at one time. If you go up in frequency, you can have a higher bandwidth. For example, 5 gigahertz was somewhere in the 50s for open channels, 50 non-overlapping channels, sorry. And in a more practical demonstration in a SDR software, you can see that I'm listening into 104.3, uh, the FM station, and you can see like the range between. It is not exactly on 104.3. FM radio requires a larger bandwidth than that singular frequency, and therefore it needs a little more than just that one channel. So moving on, we have modulation. And this is just how the RF signal encodes information, because while it's great to know that RF signal moves data, we don't actually know how it carries that signal. So you can also regard modulation as the carrier of RF signals. The 2 basic modulation methods are called amplitude and frequency modulation. In amplitude modulation, it carries the signal when it's activated. What I mean by that is when the waves start going, that's when it's carrying the signal. And what I mean by signal is like ones and zeros. So if there's no signal, it's a 0. If there is a signal, it's a 1. And in the modulated result, you can see that in the center, there's not as much data, which means not there's no signal. The vulnerabilities for this is that it's open to interference because if you have multiple sources broadcasting at the same time, you can't decipher whether something is not broadcasting or something is broadcasting and whether that belongs to what you want it to be. For frequency modulation, uh, it's always broadcasting the signal, but if it wants to carry a piece of data, it will broadcast faster or I guess speed is constant, so the frequency will increase. But as you can see, the modulated result, it has a higher frequency in places where the data should be there. All right, the legal stuff. In the US, the FCC regulates the radio portion of the spectrum, meaning that it distributes or regulates what can be used on certain frequencies. And they do this because they want to minimize interference with other sources. For example, if a radio station wanted to broadcast on a certain frequency, it would be conflicting to have another radio station broadcast because the range of a radio broadcast is pretty large. They hand out licenses for this so that whoever owns that license is the dedicated owner of that radio frequency space. Some frequencies don't require licenses, like 2.4 gigahertz, where that is like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, your personal area network. And there's other stuff. Amateur radio does require a license in some instances, but it allows citizens to broadcast on that. All right, here's the RF spectrum. They have multiple agencies that recognize different standards, but this one is pretty popular. So you have very low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, super high frequency, and EHF. I forget what the E stands for in this instance, but it helps determine what devices use what and what commonly uses those frequencies. All right, moving on to the tools that I have uh, defined today. SDR is like your toolkit for radio. It's well, back in the day when you had analog radios, you would turn the knobs to the desired frequency. But now in a digital world, you can have much finer precision with software-defined radio. And what I mean by that is like you can listen to whatever frequency you want down to like the decimal. It's pretty precise. Uh, I would say the two most popular and well-known tools for that is the RTO SDR and the Hack RF1. Uh, the RTO SDR can be acquired for a great price, less than $50 for two antennas and the attachment itself. A Hack RF1 is quite a ways more expensive. It's like $300, but for the capabilities it has and the community that is behind it, it's not bad. The multi-tool devices, there is a Flipper Zero here. This is what that looks like. It is why do I say it's multi-tool? Well, it's not only limited to radio waves. It has infrared capabilities, NFC, and like GPIO, iTags, that sort of thing. I have the RTO SDR with me. It's just a USB dongle. It's unassuming, and it has a an antenna port going out, and it only receives and does not transmit. So it will not do the devious things that you would like it to do, but it can still access public resources. Uh, Let me go over that. Public resources that are not limited to this is like publicly broadcasted weather channels ADS-B decoding, FM and AM radio, of course, and in certain cases, Van Eck phreaking. I shall explain all of this. Publicly broadcasted weather channels. There are um, there are certain frequencies set up by the government that always broadcast a weather signal so that you can set up your own localhost radar on your computer. I believe in LA it's 162.55. I did try, but I think given that we're in indoors, it's not really possible to get that frequency right now. Uh, ADS-B decoding is it's used for airplanes. So in that frequency, which I believe is 1090 megahertz, you can get location data, you can get call signs. So no longer do you have to restrict yourself to airplane Wi-Fi if you want to find where you're going. You just I wouldn't say intercept, you just read the signals that it's broadcasting from the airplane and set up a map, and you can see where exactly you're headed. FM and AM radio is pretty obvious. We've all had radio in our lives, and Van Eck phreaking is a phenomenon discovered in the 1970s. At the time, there was something called a CRT TV, and it was oozing in radiation. So because it was oozing in radiation, you could potentially read those signals and recreate it on a different display. So uh, it's not as easily done nowadays because display technology has shifted from CRT to LCD, OLED, etc. And the radiation that it emits from the source is much smaller. And it's normally done on like VGA, DVI, HDMI cables. DisplayPort is a bit harder to do because the cable itself has more shielding and has less room for leaking those radioactive signals. I tried getting a setup for that today, but given that these displays in the room have display port cables, I don't think I could do it. So, what if you did have an SDR that can transmit, such as a hack RF1? You can try certain attacks that can mess up with things. Disclaimer, I haven't tried these before for legal reasons. There is a replay attack, a roll jam attack, and a relay attack. Now let's set up a scenario where you have a car and you want to copy the key fob. Well, if the key fob were to be pressed and you were listening at the right time and the right frequency, you could capture that key fob frequency and replay it at a different time. Now, if the car was a bit more modern, like past 2012 modern, uh, the key would normally come with something called rolling code, which means that it will always change the code whenever you press the key fob button. Uh, this isn't the most it's supposed to be more secure, but it depends on how you actually do implement the rolling code, but you would still have to figure that out. But the next two ways bypass rolling code. There's something called a roll jam attack, which at the right frequency, you can jam the signal so that the car does not unlock or lock. And then you would capture the second signal because you're already jamming the first. And the human mind might think, oh, my key just doesn't work the first two times. It'll work on the third, and it'll get used to it. But if you just keep capturing the signals and then you would replay it, then you have essentially defeated rolling code. With relay attacks, you are extending the range of an RF signal. So you can, in certain cases where a car might have uh keyless entry, where you only need to bring the key close enough to the card to trigger a authentication challenge. You can extend the key signal from far away and bring it close to the car, trigger the challenge, and open the door, which is quite ingenious in my opinion. Uh, Now, what about Flipper Zero? It supports RFID, both passive and active, of course. Infrared, NFC, and sub 1 gigahertz, which is RF. Passive RFID is a form of RFID that does not require a battery. Uh, it only requires the reader to have or to send out an electromagnetic signal, which will run through the coils in passive RFID, make a current, and then it will return the corresponding data. With infrared, as you might notice earlier, it's in a range that is higher than microwave and radio. So it doesn't really classify as a radio wave, but it's still on the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum. NFC is a much finer and lower energy subset of radio, and sub 1 gigahertz is just the capabilities of the Flipper Zero. It cannot transmit higher than that. And a few demos I shall go over. Let's see. On the right for Zoom viewers and on the left for room viewers, you have a prox card. This may or may not open a certain gate in a known area that you guys might be familiar with, but it is unencrypted and it just holds just essentially a key to get into a certain gate arm. On the right is my student ID. Surprisingly, it still has RFID data that you can read. And finally, over here is an AirTag. Apple designed it so that if it gets lost, you can just um, read the NFC data that comes off of it, and it should work. And hopefully, I can get the Flipper Zero to read all of them. Whether the data will be actually usable or not will be a different story, but with the prox card, you can definitely emulate it and you can definitely open the gate arm. See. Right. First, hopefully. So I can read my student ID with the NFC mode. Hopefully that UID is not usable by any means, but we shall see about that later. Uh, Assuming that you come up to a reader, say like I should say this. Assuming you come up to a reader, say like a business that needs the student ID, you can use your flipper if you want and emulate the exact signal, and theoretically it should work. Um, ooh, okay. In and you might question it like, can you use this on credit cards as well? Well, if you had the physical access to a credit card, I would recommend that if you had malicious intent, you would just use the card instead. But the credit card nowadays usually has some sort of protections against it that won't broadcast all of its information onto a flipper. And if you were using like Apple Pay or whatever the alternative for Google or Android is, it's similar to rolling code where it's a one-time token. So let's move on to the prox card. See if I can. It's definitely not NFC. And okay, so with the prox card, I can use the RFID mode here, and you just set it down. And as you can see, it immediately reads. Um, the prox card is not that secure, and it's only, at least the security purpose of it is that you have to be as close as possible to the reader for it to work. that's how a passive RFID works. So as long as they don't have physical access to your machine or not machine, your card, you should be fine. And finally, with the AirTag, this one needs NFC. Right? NFC mode. And it can read the AirTag in a device that is NFC enabled, you can actually uh see who owns the AirTag and the information you would need to get the AirTag back to the person. If the AirTag didn't belong to you, well, I wish you good luck in finding who owned that AirTag. Uh, but yeah, the flipper is useful for reading and re-emulating these signals and helping you with these endeavors. Yes. So for those in the room that would like to play around with the flipper, I invite you to come forward and mess with the flipper. Just be sure to not leave any information in the flipper that might be sensitive. So yeah, that concludes. Actually, I shall explain. Actually, I don't. Can I do that? Where's Bill? Oh man. Uh, I would like to show what an SDR looks like the software for it. Perhaps if I can. Okay. Here is a software-defined radio. In this case, it's called SDR Sharp. You have different modulation modes, narrow FM and wide FM. The difference between that is the bandwidth. I showcased this earlier with the 104.3 channel. Uh, Narrow FM wouldn't work on it because the bandwidth is not big enough and the stream wouldn't have that much data. So before I blast that out, okay. I have to, for this to work, I have to choose the device. In this case, RTL SDR-USB. And you can change the frequency to whatever you want. Because I'm indoors, it shouldn't pick up anything. So this is called a waterfall. And ideally, if there were any signals that could be picked up in this room, you would see a clear color contrast on the waterfall. Um, Moving on to AM. AM is the amplitude modulation. It's it's either there or it isn't. And because it's a lower frequency than FM, usually it's used for lower frequencies, which is designed to go further. Um, DSP, LSP, USB, CW, and RAW are a bit beyond the basic scope of it, but are different and additional modulation methods. Uh, Let me go over the four dials over here. Your zoom is how much of the spectrum you can see at one time. Helpful if you want to focus in on a certain set of frequencies. Contrast, well, it changes the difference of colors in the waterfall. And if you were to actually see a signal, if you were at a strong contrast, the signal would be red. Range. Range and offset helps you tune like the spectrum so that it's at an ideal volume. Uh, Typically for an RTL SDR, they would say to put the range at -70 and the offset usually would be automatic. And if I had the Van Eck freaking simulation working, there is a software called Tempest SDR. Let me get this to stop. Continue screen share. Okay. So originally the Tempest SDR does not work with Windows very well, but someone was able to get it working. And it was originally designed for the Hack RF1, but there is something called DLL files, and as long as you get the right one for the RTO SDR, it would work. Let's see here. So you would load in the right system and oh, that is not working well. Ooh. There you go. Let me go over that again. You will load the right device with the source and oh, okay. Maybe I can't load it twice. Granted that I just loaded it, but interesting. Is SDL short stop? Let me try. Let me try again. Okay. You would load the device. Yes, there we go. And the image would look very black and white because it would be hard to capture color information, but you would just move your antennas close to the back of the screen where the display cable connects with the monitor, and you would ideally get a somewhat of an information feed. And yeah, I think that concludes my presentation.